During the contraction of the British Empire, the colony of Aden, strategically positioned on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, was one of the last of this global power in the region, but as other countries sought their independence, the withdrawal from Aden would not go without a fight, leading to a bitter confrontation known as the Aden Emergency that would define the mid-1960s. The colony of Aden was seized by the British in 1839 due to it being a nest of pirates that threatened vital shipping in and out of Bombay in British India, the colony having no strategic or intrinsic value and would remain simply a backwater of the vast British Empire until the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, which turned the Red Sea into one of the most important waterways in the world on the main routes between Europe and Asia, Aden being repurposed for use as a coaling station, with coal being gradually replaced by oil during the early 20th century, as demand for this new form of fuel saw an exponential rise, the British declaring Aden a crown colony, while at the same time drafting various treaties with the local rulers so as to create the wider Aden Protectorate, essentially meaning Britain had control over a large area stretching from the Yemen in the west to Oman in the east, while the northern border was largely undefined due to the presence of the Rub al-Khali, also known as the Empty Quarter, which separated Saudi Arabia from the British colonies of the southern peninsula and comprised large swathes of uninhabitable desert that was of little value to either faction. Under the rule of the British, the local sheikhs, emirs and sultans were allowed to perform their functions with little interference, with the exception of tribal confrontations that threatened British interests, with the imperial government often intervening to replace hostile leaders with ones more amiable to colonial rule if the situation called for it. Technological advances after World War I, which saw Aden become an important stopover for newly established air corridors between Europe and the Far East, meaning the ability for the British to enforce their rule in the colony was much easier to undertake, with any potential for uprisings being put down through the use of air raids on certain towns and villages that were forewarned through the dropping of leaflets by the RAF, allowing local inhabitants the opportunity to evacuate before the British aircraft bombed their empty town, while the effort of having to rebuild their settlement would keep the tribal factions out of trouble without resulting in human casualties for either side. Aden, throughout the 1920s, 30s, and even through World War II, flourishing as far as it could, due to the presence of vital oil and salt shipments to support the wider British Empire. However, in the wake of World War II, it was evident that the economic and political constraints of a heavily damaged empire would not be enough to sustain continued rule over the colonies, and thus a policy was adopted that would allow for the development of self-sustaining governments that would maintain law and order in the region following the inevitable departure of the colonial forces. The British, much like when they withdrew from their colonies in Southeast Asia, proposing the creation of the Federation of South Arabia, which would comprise the Aden state and various tribal areas, with a fully functioning new capital city being established to rule this collection of nations, dubbed Al-Ittihad, or Independence. The British prepared to undertake their departure from Aden peacefully as soon as a constitution had been finalised, though due to deep-rooted tribal divisions between the countries that were to be forced together into a future nation, interminable negotiations and arguments continued as every party concerned strove to ensure the maximum amount of profit from independence, while as far as an effective government was concerned, the main change was that the governor became the High Commissioner and his secretariat the High Commission. Though the British concept for a peaceful handover looked good on paper, the reality was that the colonial government had failed to consider the non-homogeneous relationship between Aden and the tribelands, the Adeni being more used to the comforts of modern culture and saw the tribesmen as primitive Stone Age people, while the tribesmen looked upon the Adeni with deep distrust due to their complacent nature, the naturally warrior-like tribesmen being easily capable of overthrowing the comparatively idle Adeni should open warfare commence in the wake of the British departure, an inevitability the colonial power was fully aware of. These matters made worse following the 1962 assassination of the ruling Imam of Yemen, Imam Yahya, and the subsequent overthrow of his son and heir, Imam Mohammed el-Badir, only a week later by a military coup, Yemen proclaiming itself a republic, while Imam el-Badir, exiled in Saudi Arabia, commanded a royalist faction that undertook a brutal civil war against the new military government, as financed by the Saudis and assisted by British and French mercenaries. The new government of Yemen laying claim to territory under British control, primarily due to the fact that, under colonial rule, these areas had been turned from valueless, arid desert into civilizations with sophisticated infrastructure, a more profitable commerce, and better port facilities, the Yemeni army preparing its forces for a full invasion of Aden and biding their time for the departure of the British colonists. Worse still was the interference of Egyptian dictator Abdul Gamal al-Nasser, who had scored a huge political victory, if not a military one, against the British and the French during the Suez Crisis of 1957. and now had grandiose ambitions as to creating a pan-Arab empire across the Middle East, with himself proclaimed de facto emperor, the Republic of Yemen being very much within his sphere of influence, and thus he was willing to provide support wherever necessary to the military government in their civil war against the royalists, delivering financial aid, troops, air support and advisors, while also lending his voice to the claims of the Yemeni government as to their rights over what were currently British possessions, not going so far as to declare open conflict with the British, but willing to support terrorist groups that were conducting assassinations, bombings and mass shootings within Aden and the Tribe lands so as to drive out the colonials and stop the creation of the Federation of South Arabia. The Egyptian Intelligence Service, or EIS, which was well funded and answered directly to Nasser, being provided a dedicated headquarters in the Yemeni capital of Taiz, and was manned with operatives trained by both the KGB of the Soviet Union and the CIA of America, as both Cold War factions sought to curry favor with the Egyptian leader. With the support of Egypt and the military government in Yemen, the first of the two terrorist groups emerged as the National Liberation Front, led by Katan al-Shabi, who sought to evict the British from Aden, destroy any proposals for the Federation of South Arabia, and would declare a new socialist state incorporating Aden and all territories formerly under the control of hereditary tribal chiefs in alliance with the British, their sole motivation, behind their public political directives, being to loot the wealth of Aden and redistribute it among their poorer Arab neighbours, while in the long term seeking to side with the Soviet Union as a political ally in the wider Cold War, the National Liberation Front, at most, being nothing more than a terrorist organisation rather than a functioning political body, and was manned by criminals and bandits who simply sought personal glory. The other terrorist body operating in Aden being the Front for the Liberation of South Yemen, which was led by a clique of politicians, notably Abdullah al-Aznag, a former Aden trade union leader, and fellow Adeni, Mohammed Salem Bazindwa, both men having been exiled to Cairo, and thus did not lead their factions as directly as the rival National Liberation Front, although while the ideologies and goals of both sides were generally the same, the Flossie Group were a far more sophisticated organisation that played the role of terrorists as a means to an end, neither side agreeing to work with each other for the overthrow of British rule, but were eagerly played off each other by the EIS as a means of causing as much chaos as possible to destabilise British rule. Therefore, amid all these factors conspiring against them, the British soon found themselves sat atop an extremely violent powder keg of political intrigue, deep-seated tribal distrust, and wider Cold War politics that played the two rival terrorist organisations off each other like pawns. The start of what would become the Aden Emergency coming on December 10, 1963, when an NLF operative threw a grenade at a gathering of British officials at Aden Airport, though despite the grenade not reaching its target, the low stone wall it landed against sent far more debris against the officials and caused far more damage than what would have been achieved by the grenade alone, the explosion leading to the death of one British officer, while 50 others were injured, including the High Commissioner. This opening terrorist act, as measured by British intelligence officials with a good understanding of the rising tensions of the region, being a clear sign that any chance of a peaceful transition from colonial rule to the formation of the South Arabian Federation was now well and truly off the cards, the NLF following with a number of assassinations, mostly against Arab targets that included political opponents, known or suspected supporters of Flossie, personal enemies, and all the informers of the Aden Police Special Branch, an indication that the Aden Police was rife with NLF supporters, and that no one in this arm of the law could trust their colleagues, while at the same time already lacking the manpower and equipment necessary to suppress such an insurgency. The rival Flossie, which was less militant and less well supplied, confining themselves to the occasional attack, designed to maintain their terrorist credentials without putting themselves at risk, the greater concern being protecting themselves against the NLF. On the British side, Sir Richard Turnbull occupied the position of High Commissioner of the Aden colony, his main role in the twilight years of imperial rule being to develop the independent Federation of South Arabia before overseeing a peaceful transition from British to Arab rule. Turnbull being an experienced colonial administrator who had seen a long career in Palestine and Africa, overseeing the peaceful transfer of power from British to local control while serving as governor of Tanganyika. Though even to the most experienced administrative officers, the situation in Aden was one totally unique when compared to other colonies of the wider British Empire, both in terms of people, geography, and the brewing political emergency. While due to the presence of the NLF in the police force and other government offices in Aden, the British could not rely on these factions to support them in suppressing the terrorist threat, the result being that the colonial administrators could only rely on the British Army as a means of keeping the peace, with the main force in the colony being 3 battalions of the Aden Brigade, who were present simply to show the flag, rather than acting as a general police force, their ability to respond to the violence of the NLF being severely restricted in order to ensure that minimum force was used to combat provocation. the only other support for the colonists being from the federal government of what would become the future Federation, who drew upon its authority to form a constitution not yet fully ratified, though in practice the new Federation government had very little influence over the tribal leaders. Initially, the Aden Emergency constituted simply gathering up suspected members of the NLF or Flossie, with the Aden Police Special Branch, under the command of Deputy Superintendent Harry Barry, running patrols that gathered up suspects both discriminately and indiscriminately, the counter-terrorist effort being informed by unreliable intelligence, while the capture of suspects ranged from either being in the vicinity of a grenade attack, having caused a disturbance in the streets, or simply because the soldier or police officer disliked their face or attitude, the arrested being held without trial in the overcrowded prisons of the colony, until a new detention camp was established that was manned by Army and RAF staff that introduced better accommodation for the prisoners and, for the first time, correctly identified and documented those detained, the efforts of Deputy Superintendent Barry being generally unsuccessful both when it came to rounding up suspects or interrogating them due to an overall lack of resources, thus giving the NLF resolve to start focusing their efforts against colonial targets rather than Arab ones, as demonstrated when a British bank manager was shot and killed in the street, while leftover World War II rocket launchers, as supplied by the EIS, began to be employed by the insurgents, and provided a far greater degree of accuracy for the terrorists against the Land Rover patrols of the British Army and Aden Police. The main target for the terrorists was soon determined to be the Aden Intelligence Centre, which came under the first recorded rocket attack of the Aden Emergency during a night raid on the Registry Building, the AIC housing the bureaucrats of the High Commission, and was a notoriously vulnerable building ripe for ambush, especially its main entrance, as demonstrated when Deputy Superintendent Barry, due to his efforts against the terrorists, was assassinated at the AIC front gate by 4 men armed with 9mm pistols, 40 rounds pouring into his distinctive yellow Mini, and leaving no doubt that the Aden Emergency was going to require a committed effort by the British colonial force in order to ensure a transition to a functional government, and not leave behind a country rife with civil unrest and tribal-based terrorist insurgencies, the boldness of the NLF being demonstrated in that Barry's replacement as head of Special Branch, who had now been provided a personal bodyguard from the British Army, was targeted for death only the day after Barry's assassination. The efforts of the Army corporal assigned to protect the new administrator, who correctly opted to sweep his flat prior to him entering, finding an NLF gunman hiding in his kitchen, the would-be assassin able to escape the corporal's salvo of gunfire and disappeared through the back door. The British, in light of this newfound emboldening of the NLF, relocating the offices of the High Commission to the former regional headquarters of the Shell Oil Company, a well-fortified 2-story building that could easily repulse any coordinated attack by the terrorist group. Aside from a change of locale for the AIC, the organisation was also fully refreshed through a replacement of staff by experienced officers and administrators from across the British Empire, with Ted Irving, a former officer of the Royal Navy and Nyasaland Police, being introduced into the intelligence service, while John Burgess, an intelligence corps major, took on the role of liaison officer between the AIC and the commander of the Aden Brigade, the role of head of Special Branch going to John Prendergast, director of intelligence for the Hong Kong colony, and a close personal friend of High Commissioner Turnbull. Prendergast rapidly seeing the inefficiencies of the AIC and moved to have the full replacement of Special Branch with a brand new National Guard, with his highest priorities being to have more staff brought in with all dispatch, and to develop a new series of contacts within the Arab population so as to root out the NLF support, with Jock Snell, a former commander of the Hadrami Bedouin Legion, using his connections with the tribesmen and his ability to speak fluent Arabic as a means to gather information of terrorist activity in the sparsely populated remote desert regions of the Aden colony, and employed far stricter means of security when seeking intelligence from informers so as to ensure that the NLF or Flossie could not determine their identities with the same ease as they had done before, not only ensuring that informers could be protected from assassination attempts, but also gave them an air of confidence that their safety was of prime concern to the British forces, 3 good and reliable sources ultimately being acquired, while a 4th was detained by the British on suspicion of being an NLF member, when in reality he was a Flossie member spying on the NLF, this source being eager to help the British and AIC in exchange for immunity from further arrest, the creation of these sources coming at the same time as John Prendergast's appointment to Chief of Intelligence Aden, where he ensured that there would be no more excuses as to the AIC's inability to produce results. In addition, a new arm of the AIC was developed dubbed B Group, which would provide operational intelligence for the British Army so as to reduce their casualties, the Army providing all the equipment and any personnel necessary for B Group to function, while B Group itself would work alongside all sources of information and through their own detective work to identify potential NLF or Flossie hideouts that could be targeted by the army themselves, arresting members and confiscating weapons. B Group, working solely by night, and conducted their operations with a minimal number of personnel lost despite the inherent danger of their work, with only one man killed and another injured. The response of the NLF being to increase the frequency of their attacks, with grenades remaining as the weapon of choice for the terrorists, as they were much easier to come by than rocket launchers. The EIS at their headquarters in Yemen having a healthy supply of British grenades, left over following the withdrawal of Commonwealth troops from Egypt at the end of the Suez Crisis in 1957, while handguns and rifles were easily procured through Egypt's ties to the Soviet Union. The British Army bearing the brunt of the terrorist campaign, although they were not always the target, British civilians in Aden being told to keep off the streets unless necessary, with the journey to work being the most dangerous time for the unarmed. A manager of the Aden branch of a British bank, as mentioned, being shot as he entered his office, a middle-aged employee of the Port Authority being killed as he left his apartment, and a young member of the High Commissioner's staff being gunned down while running an errand, being just a few of the many examples of the innocent falling victim to the NLF's bloody war against the British. Regardless, the information on NLF strongholds and activities was flowing in, but such was the scale of the terrorist organisation that there was little to no time to interpret or act upon it. The rebel faction easily outfoxing the large-scale British army, as troops present in the field had been trained to do combat with organised armies rather than small, easily mobile factions of insurgents, 4-5 Commando Royal Marine seeing the most success in conducting strikes against the NLF in the remote tribal lands, as informed by Bedouin intelligence, but this was not enough to successfully overcome their foes, while any attempt to use heavy weapons such as airstrikes or artillery were done in sparing capacity as the British sought diplomatic routes as a means of extracting themselves from the rapidly deteriorating situation in Aden, conducting themselves in a manner that would not be an outright surrender, but at the same time would not invite condemnation from the United Nations, each victory for the NLF leading to more followers joining their cause, while the Federation Army and National Guard were so rife with sympathizers that they were essentially rendered non-functional, this lack of harmony between the various tribal leaders proving to be the death knell for the South Arabian Federation, although one notable success for the British was the arrest of Flossie founding member and leader Mohammed Salem Bazindwa, who arrived in Aden to visit his wife, though his detention was not maintained for long, as after 3 days in British custody, John Prendergast, following an interview with the terrorist leader, ordered he be released and allowed to return to Cairo, though Flossie, by this point, had generally lost any edge it had against British rule, and was now leaving the bulk of the fighting to the NLF. By 1967, it was clear that what had originally been a terrorist insurgency against British rule had now escalated into an undeclared war between NLF factions and the colonists, their formerly clandestine tactics now giving way to open rebellion that was becoming increasingly difficult to control. The High Commissioner, Sir Richard Turnbull, with his proposed South Arabian Federation now in tatters, taking the blame for the Aden Emergency, and was thus replaced by Sir Humphrey Trevelyan, who was not a colonial administrator, but instead a diplomat who had been able to cool tensions between Britain and Egypt when he was working as British ambassador to Cairo, though despite the change in political leadership, B Group, in collaboration with the army, continued their campaign against the NLF, an ever more difficult task as membership of the terrorist organisation reached its peak and hideouts vastly outstretched the intelligence capabilities of the AIC, the situation changing dramatically, though, during June 1967, when Nasser, in an attempt to establish himself as the de facto leader of the Arab states, sought to lead a crusade against the state of Israel using a vast arsenal of Soviet weapons and aircraft as supported by Jordan, Syria and Iraq, his blockade of the Gulf of Aqaba being taken by Israel as an act of war, and thus culminated in a massive preemptive airstrike against Egypt that essentially wiped out their air force while still on the ground, the Israelis subsequently occupying the Gaza Strip, dominating the Sinai Peninsula, pushing the Jordanians out of the divided ancient city of Jerusalem, and then advancing into the Golan Heights of Syria, all of which was conducted within 6 days. In the wake of the 6-day war, Nasser's prestige on the stage of Arab politics was left in ruin, his humiliation being the death stroke for his proposed pan-Arab empire, and under diplomatic pressure from Britain and Saudi Arabia, he agreed to withdraw his troops and aircraft from the Arabian Peninsula, as well as to cease military and financial aid to Yemen, though by this point, the NLF had grown to become a fully self-sustaining organisation, and the loss of support from the EIS did very little to stall their campaign against the British. Their thrust against the colonists not only being maintained through the provision of weapon stocks, but also through the loyalty won by the tribesmen of the desert regions, the inability for Britain to effectively counter the NLF, even with Egypt having been removed from the playing field, leading inevitably to the UK government being forced to negotiate directly with the terrorist group, the British, by the summer of 1967, only having true control over the town of Aden, the industrial area of Little Aden, and the federal capital of Al-Ittihad, while the most vital asset for the British in the colony was Aden Airport, which served both a civilian use and as an RAF station on the main corridor between Europe and Asia. The NLF and Yemeni government, in an attempt to prove the illegitimacy of the British occupation, demanding a UN fact-finding mission be sent to Aden as witness to the brutal rule of the colonists, though this mission was ultimately cut short due to ongoing fighting between the NLF and British Army factions, with the results of their observations being generally inconclusive. However, on June 19, 1967, the Aden Emergency truly reached its peak when, following the murder of the head of the Federal National Guard at Al-Ittihad by his own men, thus leaving the unit without a British commander, armed militia across Aden began to mutiny against the colonists, with rumours spreading rapidly among the Arab population that the British, in response, were brutally rounding up and disarming the National Guardsmen and the Aden police, thereby putting the police and guardsmen on high alert and deeply distrusting of their British masters. The matter coming to a head on the morning of June 20th, when troops of the King's Own Royal Border Regiment and the Queen's Dragoon Guards, travelling in 2 Land Rovers, were gunned down by members of the Aden police from the windows of their barracks in the Crater district of Aden town, killing 24 men and leaving 1 survivor, Fusilier John Story of the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, who escaped into a nearby apartment block and hid from the Arab gunfire for 3 hours, an army helicopter flying overhead reporting the incident, and thus saw the High Commissioner have the Crater district designated out of bounds and blockaded by elements of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, with sporadic firefighting between the mutinying policemen and the British soldiers taking place until July 3rd, after which a compromise was reached with the Aden police, who subsequently laid down their arms in exchange for receiving no retribution from the British side, the British retaking the Crater district without a shot being fired. In the end, an agreement was negotiated between the British and NLF as to the withdrawal of the colonists, the UK government seeing no reason to continue wasting time and lives on a colony that was beyond saving when it came to re-establishing some sort of political control. The NLF, now far too strong and entrenched to surrender under any circumstances, and had won over large swathes of the population with their campaign, the terms of the agreement being that, in exchange for an unopposed evacuation of British troops, power would be ceded to the NLF. Though despite the NLF having every reason not to oppose the British withdrawal, intelligence continued to present the worrying prospect that elements within the terrorist faction would undertake attacks on British aircraft departing and arriving from the Aden airport, and with this risk too great, evacuation of the Aden colony was subsequently done by sea, no official announcement being made by the High Commissioner as to the removal of British forces from Aden, though it was clear regardless of what was about to transpire, with civilians also taking the opportunity to flee the colony rather than face the rule of the NLF. Steamer Point, a once thriving marketplace run by Indian shopkeepers who had made a good living for generations selling duty-free goods to the residents and tourists, being abandoned and left a boarded-up ghost town, those who qualified for British nationality departing to the UK, while the rest disappeared back to India, an air of depression and despondency gripping the colony as Adeni businessmen, policemen, bureaucrats and professionals faced an uncertain future. Finally, on November 30th, 1967, the evacuation of the last 3,500 troops and civilians saw the British perimeter gradually whittled down throughout the course of the day to simply the dock area, as guarded by Royal Marine Commando, who were subsequently airlifted by helicopter back to the carrier HMS Bulwark out in the Gulf once the last British elements had been transferred offshore, while High Commissioner Sir Humphrey Trevelyan, after a brief handover ceremony was undertaken at the RAF station of Cormacsar, departed aboard an RAF Bristol Britannia, the last troops to leave the colony being the Royal Engineers, who were airlifted to the various surface vessels by helicopter out in the Gulf of Aden, Aden being relinquished from British control after 128 years of rule, and thus led to the merger of the Federation of South Arabia and the Protectorate of South Arabia into the People's Republic of Yemen the following day, though this would rapidly change to the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen following a shift in politics to a Marxist-Leninist one-party state in 1969, as supported by Cuba, East Germany, North Korea and the Soviet Union, the only communist state to be established in the Arab world. Attempts to create a stable region at the southern end of the Arabian Peninsula being unsuccessful, with a brief civil war resulting during January 1986 that lasted for 1 week and saw 6,000 people killed, alongside 60,000 displaced, while the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s meant support for the Marxist factions quickly evaporated, South Yemen being unified with the Yemen Arab Republic, commonly known as North Yemen, on May 22, 1990, to form the present-day Republic of Yemen, and seceded from North Yemen in 1994 to create the Democratic Republic of Yemen following a political crisis, bringing about yet another civil war during 1994, further attempts to restore South Yemen seeing the latest civil war take place during 2017 as part of the wider 2014 Yemeni civil war, which continues to rage as of mid-2023, and has so far seen nearly 400,000 people killed and Yemen become one of the poorest and most devastated countries on earth. Ultimately, the Aden Emergency proved to be one of Britain's last colonial counterinsurgency campaigns, as well as being one of its least successful, with a general ambivalence among the governing bodies and a failure to gain the trust and assistance of the Adeni people early in the NLF's terrorist campaign, meaning any attempt to secure control in the region was doomed to inevitable failure, the British withdrawal from southern Arabia completing its retreat from empire, which had started 20 years earlier with the independence of India and Pakistan, and truly spelling the end for the United Kingdom as a great power on the global stage.